Individual differences absolutely impact communication. First of all, who I am as a person, my experiences will influence how I encode a message. And then from the receiver's perspective, who I am, what my experiences are, how I view the world, the lens that I use to see the world, will impact how I decode or receive that message. And so in both ends of the communication network, that's the kind of noise that can have a negative impact on the message getting communicated the way you want it to be communicated with the intention that you had behind it. So you might communicate in a certain way that you think is appropriate, but the person who receives it doesn't think that's an appropriate communication way to communicate something. You might be communicating with more body language or facial expressions than you're aware of, and the person receiving it is interpreting that body language that might be in conflict with the words that you're using. So it is important that when you're communicating to make sure your words and your tone, your body language, all of those things are in alignment to make sure that you are communicating what it is you set out to communicate. The characteristics of the situation also can influence communication. For example, the perceptual process. We know if there's a lot of stuff going on, that's going to distract us. We're not going to be able to hear things clearly, nor will we be able to communicate clearly because there's lots of distractions. When there is more certainty and there's calm, it's much easier to communicate something. But when there's a lot of uncertainty, ambiguity, crisis decision-making, communicating in that context can be much more challenging. So when we think about the relationship between the perceptual process and communication, all those things you learned about in the first module about my risk-taking propensity, my comfort with ambiguity, my ability to self-monitor, my locus of control, all these things influence how I encode a message or how I decode a message that comes from someone else. Communication channels are probably the most important thing that we'll communicate in this particular lecture because it's getting at the extent to which the medium that you use to communicate your message has a lot of information in it or very little information in it in order to help the receiver interpret and understand what it is that you're trying to communicate. Rich communication media, like face-to-face communications or video conferencing and telephone calls, all enable you to have multiple pieces of information, both verbal and nonverbal, to help you to understand and interpret what the sender is trying to send you. Lean media, or low-rich mediums, have very little cues other than sometimes it's just basic words if you're looking at formal reports or memos. You don't get tone, you don't get nonverbals that are communicating certain aspects of communication. Now, there should be a match between the type of communication that you need to get out to someone and the channel that you use to communicate it. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But as we go from formal reports, which has pretty much words, and that's all you have to interpret and understand, and we work our way up to high-rich communication media, basically face-to-face communication, we recognize that each one of those tools can be used in different ways as we communicate to the people in our organization. Communication in an organization has tremendous directionality. It can go upward, downward, horizontal. It can go over somebody's head to somebody else. So we're talking about specifically the formal channels that exist in an organization. So downward communication essentially means the people at the top of the organizational hierarchy are communicating down to the people below them. So downward communication channels means they're being dictated to from a centralized location in the top management team, communicating it out to the rank and files who work in the organization. Upward communication works in the other direction, clearly, where it means the rank and file communicates upward. And one of the most easy ways of thinking about directionality of communication, and we think of developing corporate strategies, right? Downward corporate strategies are pretty much dictated from the top management team and communicated down to the people of what they need to do. Versus an upward communication strategy, the individuals at the bottom help to develop a strategy, and then they build that, and it builds on itself to come back up to top management team, and they assess what the rank and file believe are appropriate approaches to strategy and to meeting the organization's needs. And so that upward downward is really important in terms of recognizing what is the chain of command. In a formal structure, we care about chain of command. You don't go over your boss's head or your boss's boss's head to communicate something, because that can create real challenges for us. Horizontal communication is how one group communicates to another, or one individual communicates to another. It can be basic interpersonal communication, or it can be about how does this team communicate to the team ahead of them or behind them in the workflow to communicate what needs to get done. So how do we handle the chain of which communication has to be distributed from one individual to another? When I talked about the level of formality, formal communication channels, right, are really specific and direct regarding the chain of command, the responsibility and authority and hierarchy within the organization. Even flat organizations have still a degree of chain of command and hierarchy that you have to pay attention to. What can be complex for us is when we are working within a matrix structure, where we might have two bosses, or we might have my project boss and my functional boss, and they may be at odds with each other, which can create problems in terms of what I should do and how I should do it. Communication becomes a big issue when you're doing project management and you don't have formal authority for the individuals. You have authority for the project, but you don't have authority over the individuals to make them do something. And so that can be a big challenge as well. And again, these are not necessarily the types of things we're going to talk about in this class. What we're getting at more so is the baseline issues of structure and how communication channels are a part of a corporate structure and how they influence the way that we make decisions. Informal networks or informal communication is not necessarily work-related or related to the hierarchical chain of commands. We can have gossip chains where this person talks to this person and this person talks to that person in the cafeteria, the grapevine, as we've heard it called, or other terms are called cluster chains, whatever. I'm not as concerned about what the terminology is, but more recognizing that information doesn't always flow through formal channels. Oftentimes, the way to get information out to people in a way that's more politically astute is to use the informal network, to ask questions behind the scenes rather than making a formal request. An informal request carries a different tone, and this certainly has implications for power and politics and things like that. So pulling all this information together, how does communication channels work hand in hand with corporate structure and with decision making to have an impact on decision making? We know from reading the article, The Decision-Driven Organization, that decisions drive structure. Well, decisions drive communication channels as well. If you need to have quick decisions made, you don't want to have extra layers in your communication network creating challenges for people, requiring them to send memos or reports before they can get things approved. Verbal communication or even virtual communication through video conferencing or Skype or teleconferencing, those sorts of things. These are much quicker and a quicker way to get a decision done than if you had to go through a formal report and a formal meeting and a formal read and then time to respond and then a formal response. And the more formal your communication structure is, the more challenging it can be to be lean and agile and being able to make decisions. One of the things that we know, though, is that there are decision-making challenges in a virtual context. We know that we have to make sure, as I said, that we want to match the medium that we're using with the kinds of things that we're communicating. So if we're just sharing routine information with people, lean media is fine, because lean media can be ambiguous. It can create uncertainty. So if all you're doing is communicating something that's not ambiguous, that's very clear and very straightforward, lean communication media is perfectly fine. However, when you are dealing with more complex interpersonal communications or a more complex problem-solving issue, if we're working and trying to address a larger concern and making a really important decision that requires debate and conversation, you cannot do this via email. You cannot do this via memo. It has to be done at a minimum virtually through teleconferencing, using Zoom or using Skype for Business or whatever it is. At least visually and verbally communicating to each other so people can hear each other, they can hear tone. We might be missing body language if we're only using audio, but at a minimum, you are getting much more rich information than you would if you were simply just trying to communicate via email. So when you have more complex things to communicate, you are better off communicating it face to face. And I know that's not something that people understand or really want to embrace, because we often like to just send off a text or send off an email to communicate things really quickly, and we forget that there's a level of importance and a level of urgency that's attached to things when it's done face to face. And when it's done in a way where we can read all the cues, the tone, the body language, all the nonverbals, as well as the words. So when we're making really complex decisions, we have to recognize that we can't do it in a lean media. We cannot do it via memo or email. We really, truly need to communicate things with richer media as best as we can. If we can do it face to face, we can do that. So virtual communication and teleconferencing is the better way to go. We want to be careful, though, of the differences in national culture and the differences in just basic individual differences, how it communicates things in a virtual context. There are tremendous challenges getting tone across when we're simply doing email. And so the more that we can bring people together, even if it's virtually, seeing videos or hearing people's voices, that communicates a lot more, as I said. So our decisions can be hampered, and we may have more bias attached to our decisions if we're not allowing ourselves to have face-to-face communication with people to address some of the issues. And so the more complex and ambiguous the decision is that you're trying to make, the more you should try to have face-to-face meetings to make sure there's that no stone is left unturned, that you are truly reading each other well, you're truly communicating everything that you need to communicate, because if you do it in a one-dimensional format, which is basically through a written email or memo, you're going to miss a lot of information that can and should be communicated, which is more likely to be communicated in a face-to-face context than in a virtual context.